Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, early morning in New Zealand, midnight in Malaysia, and everywhere else in the world we have audiences coming in. My name is Lily Chang. I'm the founding director of the Chinese Culture Center at San Diego State University. I also currently serve as the chair of the board of the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum. We are presenting the Chinese American Experience and Beyond Zoom series. I am so excited to have a talk on the Peranakan Chinese by our famous Dr. Su Kim Lee. And I also want to introduce the moderator of today's session, Dr. Bob Stein, who serves as a member of the board of the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum, but also being a cardiologist, serving the American Heart Association, and also the administrator for the Palomar Hospital. Let's welcome Dr. Bob Stein.
Well, thank you very much, as always, for your lovely introduction, Lily. And we're looking forward to hearing Dr. Lisa Kim talk about the Peranakan Chinese, ancient journeys, monsoons, and myriad cultures. And if we could have the next slide, we'll talk about upcoming events. Next month, on the 19th, we're having our old friend Jean Feltzer speak about Driven Out, which is a I talk about a dark chapter in American history in the 1880s when Chinese were expelled from towns in northern California and Oregon and Washington State. And then in November, I'm going to speak about an unusual topic to some of you, Jews' presence in early 20th century China and what they were doing. At this point, I want to turn things over to our executive director, Jacinta Wang, who's going to talk about upcoming events at the museum. Jacinta?
Thank you so much, Bob. We're really excited to announce that we've got a lot of great things coming up here at the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum. We have recently opened up a new exhibit, The Art of Chunming Yu and Wan Lang. So please come down and visit us to see these wonderful artists and their artwork. Beginning Sunday, October 6th, which is the first Sunday of the month, we'll have our Asian Pacific Historic District walking tour. So we're really excited to have that. And then the second Sunday of the month, we have our free second Sunday, which means that it's free to come to the museum for everybody who comes that day. So please join us. On October 12th, that's a Saturday at 4 p.m., we'll have an opening reception for the Art of Chunming Yu and Wan Lang. So please register if you'd like to attend. And then on October 26th at 1 p.m., we will welcome author Russell Lowe to discuss his new book, A Willow Tree Becomes a Forest. And lastly, I want to encourage and invite folks, if you're interested, to check out our calendar. Coming up on November 13th, we will be taking a trip, organized trip to Mexicali. So we'll be taking our constituents south of the border to visit La Chinesca, which is the only Chinatown in the world that has its own name. So come visit us and visit us at the museum or come along with us on a trip. Back to you, Bob.
Thank you very much. And we certainly want to always thank our sponsors, the PLUS Charitable Trust and the Shu family. And at this point, I want to turn things over briefly to Dr. Yudun Wang, who's going to chat with us from San Diego State Chinese Cultural Center about upcoming events there. Yudun?
Thank you, Dr. Bob. Good morning. My name is Yudun Wang from the Chinese Culture Center at San Diego State University. I'm very happy to announce our upcoming events. From September to December, we have a calligraphy exhibits in our center. And we have more than 40 pieces art of calligraphy, and the highlights of the whole exhibit is the longest scroll. That's the 66 feet long Li Sao calligraphy. In October, Thursday, 17th, we will have Chinese calligraphy workshop in our center. And we will do some basic calligraphy skills. And also you can customize a bookmark with your own calligraphy on that. And after that, we'll have a Kung Fu workshop. It's from 12 to 2 p.m. And we have a couple exercise with the Kung Fu in our center. Please visit our website for more information. And we welcome everyone to join us. Thank you. Next slide, please. Here I'm gonna announce the guidelines for today's Zoom program. After the presentation, if you have comment, question, you may raise your Zoom hand or write your question in the chat box. Our museum executive director, Dr. Jahada Wang, will call on you when it's your turn. And before the program starts, we'll take your picture. And please turn your camera on before the beginning of the lecture. And after that, our lecture gonna start, and please turn your camera and your microphone off. And now I think it's good time for our good picture. Okay.
Please turn your camera on. Thank you so much.
Please
Love
turn.
you all. Love you all.
And beautiful smiles. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I have one more picture. Thank you. Awesome. Now back to Bob.
Thank you very much, Yudan. Before we get started, I want to mention a couple of housekeeping issues. One is that if you have questions, which I'm sure you're going to, I have a million right now and the talk hasn't even begun.
Can't hear you, Bob. Louder.
I am saying that a couple of housekeeping issues. One is that if you have questions, remember them and ask at the end, or put them in the chat box and we'll review the chat box and we'll take questions out of that. The second thing is you'll notice that we have Chinese subtitles, and our Chinese subtitles are pretty darn accurate for Chinese speakers. And the only problems we ever have is when the English speaker is attempting to say something in Chinese, which often doesn't come out right. But beyond that, it's pretty darn accurate. So today, getting back to our talk, we've got Dr. Lee Soo Kim, who is a retired associate professor at the School of Language Studies and Linguistics at National University of Malaysia, specializing in language, culture, and identity, and an author, educator, and cultural activist. She, at the moment, is coming to us from Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. Her doctorate in education explores complex language identity linkages of English language speakers in Malaysia, and she's published 15 books, academic fiction and nonfiction, including a trilogy of short stories on the Peranakan Chinese. And as you'll see below, she's co-authored a book with our discussant, Stephen Hall. And Stephen Hall is a recently retired professor, dean of the School of Interdisciplinary Studies, and head of the Center for English Language Studies at Sunway University, and now is an independent content creator. He is coming to us all the way from Gisborne, New Zealand, which is on the East Coast, known for its beaches, and also the Tarawidi Museum of Indigenous Peoples and History. And his publications range far beyond New Zealand origins to include 7 books, 50 academic papers, poetry, and the recently co-authored Manglish, Malaysian English at its Wackiest, 2nd edition, with also Dr. Lee Soo Kim. And he's passionate about true voices in these times of artifice and constant change. And at this time, we're more than thrilled representing San Diego State University, the Chinese Cultural Center, and San Diego Chinese Historical Museum to present Dr. Lee Soo Kim. So take it away.
A very good morning to everyone. It could also be a very good afternoon or good evening, depending on which part of the world you're tuning in from. Thank you very much for tuning in. I see some familiar faces, including Malaysians, still awake at the unearthly hour of 1:10 a.m. in the morning here in Malaysia. The topic for my lecture today is the Peranakan Chinese of ancient journeys, monsoons, and Myriad cultures. I'd like to thank Lily, as well as the San Diego State University, as well as the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum for inviting me to give this presentation. According to the International Organization of Migration, there are around 10 million Chinese overseas living outside China. I think it's even more than 10 million. And if you include the ancestors as well, it would come up to around 60 million Chinese overseas. So the history of Chinese migration isn't a recent one. It has been taking place for a long, long time, for as far back as thousands of years ago. And my topic is on this particular group that came over from China and settled down in Southeast Asia called the Peranakan Chinese. Next slide. So as far back as 700 years ago, back to the 14th century, these Chinese traders came over to Southeast Asia, Nusantara. We call it Southeast Asia Nusantara. And Nusantara would comprise of the Malay Peninsula, the archipelago, as well as countries on this side of the mainland Asia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Burma, Cambodia, Thailand. Now, these were not destitute, bedraggled laborers. These were not poor people suffering from hunger and poverty. These people were merchants, adaptable, enterprising, and probably with very good nautical skills, or perhaps they had the wealth to employ people to help them sail their ships across the oceans towards Nusantara. Hugging the coastline, they sailed mainly from the province of Fujian and Guangzhou. Hugging the coastline, they came across down south using the seasonal monsoons and settled down in many parts of Southeast Asia. So you'll see Chinese communities in Hoi An, in Cambodia, as far east as in Manado, Sulawesi, down in Java, Sumatra, and also in many parts of East Malaysia and West Malaysia. These nation states were not formed then. And of course, many came towards the biggest catch of all, the biggest attraction, the biggest port city of all then, which was Malacca, situated here in the center on the west coast of Peninsular Malaysia, straddling the very busy Straits of Malacca. Some also sail up north, settle down in Phuket, and up as far up north as Burma. Now, these traders depended on wind power, right? In those days, it was wind power. And they used the seasonal monsoons. They used the northeast monsoon to come down to Southeast Asia. But of course, it wasn't a simple thing of just packing up after trading and going home. They had to wait for the monsoons to change. And these would usually mean a sojourn of around 6 months before the monsoons change, before they sail back to China on the wind's power of the southwest monsoon. Now, what do these men do, settling down in these parts sojourning in these parts of Nusantara? Perhaps they were lonely. Perhaps the women were comely. Perhaps they miss their mother's cooking. Perhaps they miss home. Perhaps they yearn for some interesting conversation apart from what shall we buy, what shall we sell, because they were here as traders. So what happened was many of these men intermarried with the local women. Of course, in those days, you don't have ROMs, you don't have registration of marriages. So what they usually did was just sort of to settle down and live together with the women. Next slide. So from these very interesting interconnections between the Chinese and the local women, and when I say local women, I would be very careful to say that it's not just Malay women, because some people think it's just Chinese and Malay, but not at all. Because the complexity of it all was there was myriad cultures in Malacca, in the Malacca port cities, as well as the port cities of later on Penang and Singapore. Because if you know the history of Malaya, if you're familiar with the history of Malaya, Malacca was actually a thriving port city, as famous in her time as Venice over in Italy. And there was a lot of trading going on. There was a lot of migration and trading movements. There were traders who came from India, from Yemen, from the Middle East, and as well as from China, so East and West. And therefore, you had this interesting communities that evolved, not just the Peranakan Chinese, but you also have hybrid communities like the Peranakan Jawi, the Peranakan Chiti Malacca, the Portuguese Eurasians, and so on. But for the purpose of my talk, because it's so different from each country, I will confine myself to the Peranakan Chinese of the former Straits settlements. That would be Malacca, Penang, and Singapore, right? Okay, the generic word, sorry, can you go back to the previous slide again, please? Yes, the generic word is Peranakan, a four-syllable word. It comes from the word anak, which means child. And if you add the suffix and the prefix, it becomes a local-born community. So the Peranakan Chinese would be the Chinese, this hybrid community of the Chinese people, of the Chinese descendants. There are also lots of other names of these Peranakan Chinese, for example, Straits Chinese, and more commonly used is the term Baba and Nyonya, or Babas and Nyonyas. In fact, during my grandparents' time and my parents' time, we never used the word Peranakan Chinese. They never called themselves Peranakans. They were just Babas and Nyonyas. So this is a community that has a word for the men, Baba, which is believed to have Hindustani origins, comes from India, or it could also be an honorific for a gentleman. And Nyonya is the word for the women, and it is believed to have come from Java, right? So you see this photograph of this very interesting women, and you can definitely tell that they are not from China. Why would they be from China? Because the men came and married the local women. In those days, they were not allowed to bring the Chinese women, the wives over. Some of them might have wives back home, but they did not bring the wives. So no mother-in-laws, no Chinese wives, these were local women. And to add to the complexity of it all, because Malacca was ruled first by the Malacca Sultanate, then it was captured by the Portuguese in 1511 for 100 years. In 1641, Alfonso Albuquerque came across on his famous A Formosa, and no, I can't remember the name. He came along this famous ship, can't remember the name right now, and there was a war between Portuguese and the Dutch captured Malacca, and in 1824, Malacca was then passed over to the British. So it went through layers of colonization, Portuguese, Dutch, and English as well. Next slide. So what happened with this interesting interconnections was that through the years, as the years went by, there was a lot of fusion of different cultures, myriad cultures. And this photograph from a family album shows a very interesting hybridity in our culture. The Chinese Peranakans were very proud of the Chinese identity. So the form was very much Chinese, but the essence was very much local. Local meaning it could be Malay, Javanese, Balinese, Batak, Boyanese, Ambonese, lots of influences from Southeast Asia. If you look at this photograph, it's very interesting. It's a wedding photograph, and you do not see the bride and groom sitting together. The bride is seated on the left-hand side, the one with all the jewelry on her bosom. And the bridegroom is seated on the other side, and you can see again the mismatch of cultures. He is not in Chinese garb. He's not in a Chinese bridegroom costume. He is in fact wearing a very dapper Western suit. Look at the person in the center. you would think that the bridegroom and the bride would be in the center, but here it is not the bride and bridegroom. In fact, it's not even the patriarch. You would think that if it's a patriarchal culture and if they cling to the Chinese identity, there would be the gentleman, the man of the house seated in the center. But here it isn't. It's the matriarch. So again, very interesting. I think this is probably because of the very strong matriarchal elements in probably the Minangkabau culture, or in certain local cultures in Nusantara, where the matriarch is very important. And in many marriages between the Peranakans, after the bride, the daughter is married, she doesn't have to go and stay with the bridegroom. She actually stays there, remains there in the household with her mother, and the bridegroom is the one who moves in. So wonderful adaptation and assimilation and tweaking here and there to suit the family. The background is interesting. It's very Chinese. You can see it's a very Chinese kind of symmetrical design with always Chinese calligraphy is very important. There's a jiho there with words usually meaning good fortune and prosperity, and the traditional Chinese lanterns usually bearing the surnames of the family. Next slide. Next slide. So this is a family photograph from my album. And the little boy there, there's two boys there. The little boy is my father, the younger one is my father. This photograph would be circa 1920s. Again, it attests and shows the wonderful hybridity, the myriad cultures in the Peranakan Chinese. Not quite Chinese, not quite Malay, not quite Javanese, not quite English, but a whole mix of it all. If you see the gentleman there, standing there, he's my grandpa, my paternal grandpa. He's wearing a somewhat mix of elements as well in his Chinese jacket, but he's got a pocket watch. He's in white trousers and is standing there very respectfully. He hasn't got the prime seat. His wife, my grandmother, has the prime seat. She is seated there in her baju panjang. In the olden days, the nyonyas wore baju panjang. So baju panjang is a long cotton-like blouse, always accompanied by a sarong. For as long as I've known my grandmother, she never wore anything except the baju panjang and sarong, and later on the sarong kabaya, or the sarong with a small little cotton blouse. And you notice she's kind of in a very relaxed position. Her feet are sort of half in, half out of the slippers. And why do you think, and you notice also that Peranakan Chinese women, nyonyas, do not have bound feet. Of course, they wouldn't, right? Because they don't have any links with China. They are the local women. The love for English aesthetics also is prevalent here. You can see the background. It's not like some atap house or sampan. It's a grand English country house, probably taken in the studio, showing the love for European things. Next slide. So the Straits Chinese identity, through the years, they began as it settled down in Malacca, Singapore, Penang, and all the various parts of Southeast Asia. They began to regard this part of the world as a home. So for those in the Strait settlements, they regarded the Strait settlements as their homeland, but they still maintain a basically Chinese identity. They kept the surnames, they kept the links, but they gradually abandoned the close links of kinship, sentiment, allegiance, and financial remittances to China, so characteristic of the non-Baba Chinese. Next slide. So the Babas and Nyonyos are unique citizens of Southeast Asia, something that happened, a sociological phenomenon, a convergence of historical as well as geographical factors that took place in a time of colonization, in a time of great trading routes and trading migrations, and in a time when people were open-minded, resourceful, resilient, and just adapted and assimilated whatever helped them, whatever was good for them, they took it on. They were not living in little ghettos or silos. They were open-minded, and when they intermarried, they embraced whatever was good in whatever cultures that offered opportunities or enlightenment for them. So I would say they are a cultural hybrid, a hybrid community of Chinese, Malay, Thai, Javanese, Sumatran, Balinese, Indian, Portuguese, Dutch, English influences. I see many friends here who are Peranakan Chinese as well, who are Nyonyas here, and Babas as well. Next slide. Clement says the result of this blending is not simply a random mixture. So here's an interesting thing. It's a potpourri of bits. It's not a potpourri of bits and pieces. It is a genuine synthesis, something which not only incorporates but also transcends the component parts out of which it springs. So it's not Chinese, it's not Thai, it's not English, it's not Malay, it's not Indian, but it's everything all sort of beautifully and meshed together, and it sort of transcended all these original influences and came up with its own culture, synthesized all this into another different kind of culture, but incorporating all these wonderful elements. Next slide. Okay, I'll talk first very briefly on the Babas, because now with this flowering of interest in things Baba Nyonya, the Babas seem to have been sort of sidelined and forgotten, but it must not be forgotten that the Babas were the really resourceful people. And during the Straits settlements, during British rule, they really came into their element. They made a lot of money. They were very enterprising. And they often serve as the intermediaries between the local people and the English colonial masters. And because Malaya then at that time became the world's largest producer of tin and rubber during British rule, many Babas became very, very prosperous and made great fortunes in the rubber, tin industry, as well as other businesses as well. So this is a photograph of Baba Tan Cheng Lock. This is Tan Jiap Kim, the founder of Peranakan Association of Singapore. This is a Baba from Penang, and this is a photograph of Babas from Singapore. Next slide. So the Babas played an important role in nation building, and they also contributed much to society. They didn't just enjoy their wealth. They were philanthropists. They put money back into the country that they'd chosen to as their own. They donated vast amounts of money. They set up hospitals and schools and built roads. And many of them were great businessmen, social activists, reformers, writers, politicians, and so on. Many Babas at that time, especially those in Malacca and Singapore, many of them could not speak Chinese dialects. My own father, for example, could only speak English and Baba Malay. He went to the Victoria Institution. He was very, very intelligent, very good in maths, and he worked for a trading firm called Harrisons and Crossfields. And my mother was always very annoyed because he could only go as far up the ladder as chief clerk. I remember he was a chief clerk in the postal department, and because it's Harrisons and Crossfields, he always came back with wonderful stamps from all over the world. And I remember being so thrilled every time when he came back with the stamps. He would put the stamps into 3 piles, and then he would get my sister, my brother, and I to go lali, lat tampong, and choose, and the winner gets the best pile of stamps, and so on. And he could not speak Chinese at all, only English and Baba Malay. So many of these Babas, because of the wealth of the parents, many of them were sent to England to study, and many of them, most of them were all sent to English medium schools. Next slide. The Nyonyas. So the Nyonyas, like women in history, have gone through different phases of being homebound to being completely liberated. And I would say that this culture of such great intricacy, when I talk about the material culture afterwards, would be because the Nyonyas of the earlier generations were not encouraged to be educated. So here's a photograph of my paternal grandmother, who was always very resentful that she was pulled out from school at standard 3. She said, her parents were very fearful that the more education she got, the more intelligent she'll become. And this is not good, because the Nyonya must be a good daughter, and after that, she must get married and be a good wife. So she was always very resentful that she never was never got very much education. She was a very, very intelligent woman. And she was married off to someone she didn't love, someone she did not have any choice, to my grandpa. And I don't think she was very enthralled by him, but anyway, we stuck it together. This would be my paternal grandmother, Ho Chuan Yao. And this is my maternal grandmother, also, again, educated in the Penang Free School, but I think educated in a school in Penang, but I think she received a little more education. But again, of course, after a certain number of years, she was also stopped from going to school. But she believed very strongly in education. She had 5 daughters and 2 sons, and she made sure that all her daughters were educated. So when it came to my mother's turn, and this is my mother, she was educated up to Form 5, wanted very much to go on to Form 6 and to university, but her education was interrupted by the Japanese occupation in World War II. So this itself shows 2 generations of women, my grandmothers and my mother. And of course, in my generation, the Nyonyas of my generation, the sky is the limit. We've sort of broken through the glass ceiling, right? There's no such thing as you cannot get educated, you got to get married. So we have broken through the glass the ceiling, but because of that, you do not have all the certain crafts and arts which the women, the Nyonyas of the past, were able to engage and indulge in. Next slide. So where does one even begin? The Peranakan culture is so rich and so resplendent. It reached its zenith during from the late 19th to the 20th century. And because of the wealth of the Babas and the Nyonyas, there was a lot of resplendence in their material culture. And many, many coffee table books abound on various aspects of the material culture. So the dress itself is very intricate, very ornate. Jewelry itself, you can come across like 10 coffee table books that have been written on jewelry. Manik, I have a friend who did an entire PhD just on manik, which would be the beads. The Nyonyas did not just wear leather shoes. When they wore the sarong kabay, they liked to wear beaded shoes. And these beads came from Europe, from Bohemia. And they showed beautiful pictures, beautiful beaded shoes called kasut manik. Embroidery, I read, was influenced by the Dutch women and the European women. That itself is absolutely wonderful. I'll show some pictures afterwards. Straits Chinese houses are again another eclectic fantasy. You see Straits Chinese houses mainly in the Georgetown, in Penang, as well as in Malacca. And of course, another aspect, which is a very, very interesting, would be the Nyonya ware, the Straits Chinese porcelain. The rich Babas in those days did not just simply use normal, ordinary porcelain. They commissioned kilns in China to produce their own specific Nyonya ware according to their specifications, according to the colors that they wanted. And these were then shipped over to the Straits settlements for them to enjoy. And now today, the porcelain has become very, very expensive. They've become collector's items. For a time, the collectors were not so enthralled by these porcelain because they're very, very colorful, very gaudy in a way, with lots of symbols and religious symbols. But today, it has hit Sotheby's, Christie's, and they are incredibly expensive. I remember when I was around when I finished university, I remember my mother was always, when she conducted her ancestor worship practices in the house, she would bring out the whole tray of our Nyonya ware on this tray and walk out to the table to put out the Nyonya ware. And I realized, my gosh, if she dropped this whole tray, that would be all the heirloom gone if she just dropped the tray. So I went out to Kimisawa, a department store, and bought her some cheap Japanese porcelain for her to use instead. So I don't think the ancestors were very happy, but certainly my siblings and I were. Next slide. So here's some examples of some very beautiful material culture. The first one up here is a wedding bed. This is sent to me by the Peranakan, Jackie Yung of the Peranakan Museum. So furniture itself is another topic, very, very intricate. The Babas and Nyonyas loved intricacy, they love embellishments, they love a lot of ornateness, and they had the wealth to come up with such things. But of course, it must be pointed out that not all babas, not all nyonyas are rich. There were also poor ones, middle-class ones, the whole gamut of society. But the rich ones had vast fortunes. So a bed is not just a bed, it has to be decorated, and there's hangings and all kinds of decorations and curtains and dingle-dangles and so on. This is a picture of a porcelain ware. This little chupu here and this little teapot belonged to my grandmother and was passed down to me. So it's a family heirloom. This is a beautiful plate, which is a lent, I think, courtesy of Ken Yap, who's here actually. A beautiful porcelain plate. And here is a collar of a wedding attendant. So again, lots of intricacy. You can't just have a collar, you have to put in beads. It's full of beading. Absolutely beautiful. Next slide. Next. Now, what do you think this is? It's not a cover for it's not a cover for a dish. It's not a robot, not a computer robot. What do you think this is? It is candle holders. So can you imagine, even for candle holders, the nyonyas, because there's so much time on their hands, encouraged to just be good daughters, learn to be good homemakers, train yourself to become a good wife, and start sewing your wedding items for your future trousseau. So here is a pair of candle holders where you put the candle here and this over here. This is a pocket watch holder. Belongs to an acquaintance of mine from Penang, who said that his grandfather was so rich, he was always going to the racing track to race his race horses. And the sweet nyonya wife at home must have sewn him this very cute little pocket watch holder. So you can tell it's done by a woman because it's got flowers and not horses. This is a cherut holders. Can you imagine cherut? Just the whole cigarettes or cigars. They have got this beautiful cherut holders, and this is a pair of knee pads. When you get married, you have to kneel down in front of your parents and your seniors and pay your respects to them. And I don't think it's very comfortable because it was lots and lots of embroidery and beading, which would be then very painful. But I'm sure that knowing the nyonyas, there will be lots of padding as well. And this is a pair of boots probably owned by a very dapper dandy. The nyonyas do not wear boots. Next slide. So that would be the material culture, lots of aspects of it. And that's not just the only thing that's so rich and ornate. The intangible culture too is very, very interesting. The language, the literature, the babas were very literary, those who were very privileged. And back in the 20th as well as 19th century, there were lots of literary works done, and also translations of the Water Margin Romance of the Three Kingdoms in Baba Malay. And the babas and nyonyas love music and dance. And even till today, if you go to a Baba Nyonya event, sometimes before even the food has been served, when the band starts playing, you will see them charging towards the dance floor and getting to their feet and dance. I don't know from which part of the many cultures this would have come from, but I can tend to think that it is probably from the Nusantara influences. The sensuosity of it here. They love the music, they love the rhythms, and they love the dance. So dance, they like to dance joget, which is actually Portuguese influence. But because they were very English as well, they have a love for European aesthetics and English culture. Many babas and nyonyas love to dance, social dances like the rumba and the cha-cha and so on. And pantun would be the poetry. This would be influenced by the Malay pantun. Malay pantun is very interesting. It's a 4-line stanza. The first 2 lines are usually refer to something to do with nature. And then the last 2 lines are the 2 punchlines that deliver the impact that you are trying to get. And also Dondang Sayang, another wonderful art form of pantun, but in a sing-song version, where 2 persons will stand on the stage, and to the accompaniment of music, they'll belt out the pantun on the spot, and the person whom they address the pantun very laughingly and jokingly in a very interesting manner will then have to respond on the spot to the person who's just posed the pantun to him. Arts and crafts, rituals, festivals, and celebrations. The celebrations are mainly Chinese celebrations, although it's a hybrid culture. When it came to celebrations and festivals, the Babas and Nyonyas stuck to the Chinese festivals. So Chinese New Year was very, very important, the most important festival of all until today. We also observe Qingming, All Souls Day, Winter Solstice, Tangchik Festival, and so on. Next slide. Before I go on to language, I forgot to mention that the Babas called themselves the King's Chinese during British rule. They were the King's Chinese. But again, the complexity of it, they were very proud of the Chinese identity. They kept the Chinese names. But if you call them a Chinaman, they will bristle and say, I'm not Chinaman. I'm King's Chinese. And of course, after the King, George passed away and the Queen, Elizabeth, took over, they became the Queen's Chinese. Now, the Babas and Nyonyas of Malacca and Singapore spoke a certain Creole called Baba Malay. It is not the standard Malay that the Malays speak, but a kind of bazaar Malay with lots and lots of loan words thrown in. Probably it was a lingua franca used in the trading places, in the marketplaces, and that's how it sort of evolved from a patois to a Creole kind of language. And they've got lots of Hokkien words as well as loan words from Portuguese, for example, Almera, Dutch, Tamil, and of course, English as well. Next slide. Some examples of Baba Malay showing the relationships, because in the Chinese culture, you have words for specific relatives. For example, you have a word for your mother's elder sister, your mother's second sister, third sister, you have specific words. And so the Babas have also kept this, and they have got specific words for relationships. So they don't say sai, they say gua. Instead of you, they say lu. Grandpa, ngkong, elder sister, tachi or tuachi, if it's Hokkien, father's elder brother, ngpek, father's younger brother, ngchek, and so on. Next slide. Also, when it came to household, tia is a front hall, chin chair, open courtyard, loting, upper floor, pangking, bedroom, ting, tanglong, lamp, chat for paint, kachwa for cockroach. And for words that you do not have the equivalents in Malay, you just use the Hokkien words, tau yu, kiam chai, ku chai, chai po, koi chang, koi tiao, and so on. Next slide. So it's interesting to note that in the Strait settlements of Penang, Malacca, and Singapore, Malaccan Peranakans and Singaporean Peranakans spoke Baba Malay, whereas the Penang Peranakans, because I think of much greater numbers of Chinese immigrants from the Jiangsu province, they speak Penang Hokkien. Now, I have links with both communities because my father, on my paternal side, my father is from the Malaccan Peranakan community in Malacca, whereas my mother is a Penang Nyonya. And I grew up in Kuala Lumpur and live in KL. So I have the privilege of going back to Malacca when my parents were around and listening to all the Baba Malay expressions and idioms and swear words. And believe me, the Nyonyas are very earthy and they use lots of earthy words. And they're quite bawdy people as well. They use a lot of bawdy expressions as well. And the balata is when you get a shock, you will suddenly break in a spontaneous kind of outburst, and some of them even get up and dance and so on. I don't think you'll ever see that happening to a Chinese woman in China, but Nyonyas and many women, local women in this part of the world, balata, and so did my grandmother, balata. But when I go back to Penang to visit my Penang relatives, then they speak in Penang Hokkien, and because my mother is a Penang Nyonya, I learned Penang Hokkien from her. So Penang, what was interesting when I go for certain Peranakan events and I meet senior Nyonyas from Malacca and senior Nyonyas from Penang, they don't understand each other because the Penang senior Nyonya, the Bibit, will be speaking in Penang, and the senior Nyonya from Bibit, we call them Bibit seniors from Malacca, will be speaking in Baba Malay, and they don't understand each other. But fortunately, I can understand both sides. So some examples of Penang Hokkien words: sabun, kawin, manja, botak, tahan. These are Malay words. Some Hokkien words: kakilang, which means our people, chak pui, chang it, pai se, ambong bong. I like the ambong bong. Kamsia. Kamsia means thank you. And this word, kakilang, was used in this movie, Crazy Rich Asians. If you watch the movie, you'll see the snobbish matriarch, played by Michelle Yeoh, telling Rachel, this girl, you are not our kakilang, meaning you are not one of us. And I think it's probably inserted there because Adele Lim is one of the writers, and she's a Nyonya from Malaysia. Next slide. Nyonya cuisine. I think like all small cultures, all small endangered cultures, they're all in the danger of disappearing. They're all in danger of being watered down and slowly, gradually disappearing. But if there's some aspects of the Peranakan Chinese culture that will remain, I think it would definitely be the Nyonya cuisine. It's a fabulous kind of cuisine. And again, as what Clement says, it's not a specific kind of ethnic group. It is not Malay, although we have lots of curries and entire repertoire of sambals and curries and chutneys. It is not Chinese, although we use things like dao jiao and hak yao and sang chao and methods which the Chinese use. It is not English, not European, although we also love our potatoes and we have interesting sandwiches like roti babi. Now that itself is an oxymoron, roti babi, because Muslims do not eat babi, but we have a dish called roti babi, which is very English, where you put in the filling of minced pork and peas and onions into a sandwich, and then you toss it in egg and you fry it in a pan, and it's absolutely delicious. And again, English influences. You then after that eat it with Worcester sauce, Lee and Parents. It is not Thai, although you've got lots of Thai elements as well, especially Penang Peranakan cuisine. It is not Indian, but of course you have a lot of Indian influences. You've got wonderful curries, spicy sambals, and lots and lots of spices, cardamoms, cloves, star anise, nutmeg. I mean, even put nutmeg in a soup in itik tim. So I can't help thinking of this conversation. Sometimes I play the conversation in my head, where let's imagine the first Chinese trader comes along. He marries this local woman, but he's missing his mother's food back in China. Like, hello, why are you always cooking? Why are you always cooking curries and sambals? How can you make that braised chicken dish that my mother used to make? And the local woman, the local wife, wondering what braised chicken. Okay, I'll try and do this braised chicken. What does your mother put in it? Tao chiao. So she puts in tao chiao. But being a local nyonya, she will not just do braised chicken with soya sauce. So she's in a whole dollop of garlic. So you've got like 13 to 15 garlic and a whole handful of shallots, maybe 25 shallots. She'll cook the garlic first till it's golden, put in the shallots all minced, and then throw in the tao jiao, then only put in the chicken, and then you get a braised chicken dish, but it's now called pongte, right? So that's a famous pongte. So there's a whole repertoire, and again, there are tons of cookbooks on Nyonya cuisine. It is a very labor-intensive cuisine, so don't forget this culture and cuisine evolved in a time when life moved slower at a more gentle pace. Many households were very rich. There was a whole coterie of servants, stable hands, gardeners, and in early days, there were even slaves, right? And the emphasis was not just on a very, very good taste, not just on the deliciousness of it, there was also tremendous emphasis placed on presentation, on the whole presentation, the color, the textures, they all have to blend, as well as finesse. finesse is very important. No such thing as horrible, big, bulky potatoes, horrible, huge chunks of chicken. Everything has to be very beautifully julienned. For example, this is a dish called juhu cha, and there's no such thing as using a mandolin in those days. You have to cut by hand to get the crunch of the turnip. And everything has to be very, very fine. I remember when I used to help, when my sister and I used to help my grandmother, my mother in the kitchen. Grandmother would come around as a quantity and quality inspector. And whenever she saw something that was tak sorono, not genteel, she'll pull out her hair digger, which she wore in a sangle, and she will poke you with her hair digger. So that's how quality was maintained. Or she will smack your hand. Tak sorono, so you were drilled from young to be very sorono. It's very hard for us modern women now because we don't have servants but we have machinery. We have things like food processor and air fryer and so on, but it's just not the same. Now this is a meal. This picture is not taken from a magazine. It was a meal which I cooked for my husband, who happens to be the discussant as well here, Stephen Hall. He and his friends love Nyonya food, and once in a while, I cooked a Nyonya meal for them as a kind of a supper club for his friends who love Nyonya food. It's not easy to get good Nyonya food because it is very labor intensive, and I really take my hat off to all the people who try to open restaurants because it's not easy. The staff will think you're crazy because you keep telling them to cut it finer, finer. And Stephen is the one who's very experienced in matching Peranakan Nyonya food with wine. So these are the wines here, which he can probably tell you about later. Next slide. So again, innovation, imagination, adaptability, and Penang Peranakan dishes and Malaccan and Singaporean dishes. You also have in Thailand, in Phuket, you've got Thai Peranakan dishes. If you go to Terengganu, where there's a very ancient Peranakan community there, they have Terengganu Peranakan dishes, Kelantan Peranakan dishes, and so on. So it varies from place to place. There are commonalities, but of course, as well, there are differences. So here I tried to put in more pictures, but the file got too big. So I just have one picture, one slide here, some Penang Peranakan dishes, otak-otak, which is a lovely steamed mousse of coconut and seafood, with lots of wonderful curry, with lots of wonderful spices, wrapped in banana leaves with a base of pepper leaves. Juhu chow, which is a sweet turnip that is wrapped up in lettuce and eaten. But again, knowing the Nyonyas, you do not just eat it by itself. You have to have the condiment, the spicy sambal belacan. Top hats is interesting because we don't wear top hats. And for a while, I thought this was from Nusantara, but now I'm inclined to think that it is probably European influence, because when I was in Denmark in a holiday once, I saw this mouse hanging on the wall of a Danish restaurant. And when I asked the owner, did you get that from Malaysia? No, this is my family mouse. So probably European influence top hats, because the Europeans wear top hats. But trust the Nyonyas to put in all this work and put in lots of filling. Acha awak is a kind of like pickle salad, but again, cooked in a wonderful paste of spices. Kerabu. Asam laksa is a wonderful fish broth, and it has been voted as one of the top 10 dishes, I think, by Time magazine not too long ago. Hongke, purut ikan, sambal prawn. Petai is a prawn sambal with sting beans, and lots more. There is a whole repertoire. It's not just main dishes. You also have starters, you've got condiments, you've got chutneys, you've got salads, you've got soups, the entire repertoire of dishes, and as well as desserts. And as if that is not enough, the Nyonyas also came up with kuih, probably very much influenced by the local women, by the local Malays who made very good kuihs. And so we have a whole array of kuihs as well. Kueh, kueh, which there's no English equivalent. It's not a cake. It's a kind of dessert or sweet delicacy which you enjoy after a meal. Next slide. Okay, the other aspect of the Peranakan Chinese culture, which I think as everything slowly sort of disappears, would be the Nyonya Sarong Kabaya. So this is the dress of the Nyonyas. It's not a costume, it's a dress. This is what the Nyonyas wear. In the past, they used to wear the baju panjang, the long cotton tunic top and a sarong. But in the 20th century onwards, while Queen Victoria was still walking around in the corset and the button-up crinolines, the Nyonyas began to adapt to make their baju panjang more sassy and more sexy and more interesting. So the blouse got shorter and shorter until it reached up to the waist length. And notice they don't just cut it right across, they do a V-shaped panel to enhance the figure even more. And the cloth is very diaphanous. It's not thick linen. For heaven's sake, you cannot have a kabaya of linen. It has to be a diaphanous material, usually Swiss voile. And also it's V-shaped here and V-shaped there. And to top it all, to accentuate the figure even more, it's princess line cut, and to put in even more work is sent to a tailor to make the ketuk lubang, where you have little tiny holes sewn into the hems. So the trick, so the younger ones, the younger nyonyas would wear the sarong kabaya, whereas the older bibiks would still wear the traditional baju panjang. But nowadays, mainly the sarong kabaya is in fashion today. Next slide. So the nyonya kabaya can be divided into three types of kabayas: kabaya biku, kabaya sulam, and kabaya renda. Kabaya started off as a simple blouse with lots of patterning, lots of embroidery, using the Singer sewing machine to make these patterns on the edges of the blouse, as well as on the hemline and the sleeves and the neckline. And while you think it looks very simple, according to a kabaya maker, Vedi from Indonesia, he told me that this is a lot of work. Can you imagine? You've got to use the machine and you've got to sew over and over and over and over many, many times to get the strength in the pattern. This is called the ombak design. So every little wave, ombak means wave, you have to put in a lot of work. And as if that's not enough, they also have the karawang, where you cut holes, cut lace work, where you cut holes inside, and using, again, thank goodness for the Singer sewing machine, you sew a web-like, kind of spider web-like across the holes, giving it a very ornate pattern. I have an example here where you can see tremendous workmanship, tremendous detail, a lot of work, right? Next slide. The kabaya sulam. So in the past, a kabaya was bespoke, meaning you bring along your precious cloth, your Swiss voile, to the kabaya maker, the sulam maker, and she would then sew the kabaya according to your specifications. Now, so if you were a sea lover, if you wanted to take up scuba diving but never had the chance, you could actually tell your kabaya maker, look, I don't know how to swim, but can you make me a kabaya full of seashells and scuba divers and octopus and fishes? And the kabaya maker, if she's very talented, could actually do that for you. Or in the case of this kabaya, if you were someone who loved fairy tales, I want a kabaya with Thumbelina, the frog, and the little swan. Can I have that? And they could also sew that for you. And of course, kabayas usually have you could go the whole range. You could have it very Chinese with dragons and phoenixes and quilins, or you could have a very English kabaya with butterflies and flowers. It's up to you entirely. Right, so it was very much bespoke then, but of course, like everything that requires a lot of work, these artisans are gradually disappearing. Artisans who can do this kind of incredible kabayas, you can actually count in your fingers today, and most kabayas nowadays are mass-produced. You can still find artisans, kabaya makers who can sew these kind of very intricate sulam patterns, but it become at a very expensive price and can become like collector's items. Next slide. So here's my kabaya, which I also commissioned a kabaya maker, the famous Auntie Kim, Lim Swee Kim, who was unfortunately passed away in 2014. Here I was the president of the Baba Nyonya Kuala Lumpur Association, and at the inaugural convention of the Babas and Nyonyas organized by the KL chapter. And I wanted a kabaya which shows the passing of culture, the transmission of knowledge from the older to the younger. And she came up with this lovely idea of an older Nyonya and a younger Nyonya and a basket of oranges, I think. Beautifully done. And I've been told that when it comes to human figures, it's very, very difficult to do human figures. Next slide. And the third category of kabaya is called the kabaya renda. Again, most likely influenced by the Dutch or the English with the love for lace. And this is a kabaya owned by my grandmother. Lace work, beautiful lace work, and the motif of bikers here, which I find really interesting. So here is not flowers and butterflies, it's biker. It's a picture here of bikers wearing a crash helmet, leather boots, and on motorcycles. Now, how that came to be, I have no idea. Okay, Kabarinda. And what's exciting now is that there is a move to try to get UNESCO status. Five nations are involved to try and get UNESCO status recognition for the kabaya, worn by the women, not just the Nyonyas, but also the women of Nusantara, Brunei, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. Next slide. So the Nyonyas will not just wear the kabaya and the pair of pants. No, not at all. They will wear the sarongs. So again, the sarongs are simply magnificent. If you visit some of the museums in Indonesia, they're jaw-dropping, beautiful batik sarongs. Because the Babas and Nyonyas were not Muslims, they were not confined to just wearing batik with no kind of like likenesses of animals they were not confined to certain patterns. They were free in their choices. So they liked lots of flowers. They could have dragons. They could have even fairy tales in their batik sarongs. And usually these sarongs were sourced from Indonesia, Java, from Pekalongan, Lasem, Cirebon, and so on, right? And I think the Nyonyas were already into sustainability because they do not have zips or buckles or buttons for their clothes. Kabayas were held together by a croissant, three brooches joined by chain link fence, by a chain, right? So if one brooch should fall off, the chain will still hold on to the brooch and you will not lose it. And if you put on weight, you just adjust the lapels of your kabaya. And of course, for sarongs, you can adjust it no matter what size you are. And you never just wear a sarong kabaya, you always show off with, you always flaunt your jewelry. If you have it, you flaunt it. So when they came to functions, you'll be wearing jewelry, not just on the ears, but also on the necks, necklaces, also on the hands, on the fingers, the rings, on the arms, bracelets, and on the ankles, anklets, and on the bosom, brooches, croissants, and even the belt is not just a horrible leather belt. They have silver belts to tie up the sarongs. And on the feet, they wear these beautiful manik shoes. This is made by Mr. T.S. Lim of Malacca, who was given a UNESCO award in recognition of his artisanship in doing beading for shoes. So this is all embroidered, very, very fine beads. And all these things belong to me. They're not from magazines. Okay, next slide. So if you want to see parts, if you are in this part of the world and you want to see a glimpse of this material culture or the intangible culture, there are, I think, there are three places in this part of the world. In Malacca, I would strongly recommend the Baba Nyonya Heritage Museum. It's called a museum, but it's actually a living family home. It's owned by the Chan family. Baba Chan Kim Lay had this wonderful idea of converting his three terraces, his house, which is three terrace houses put together, into a museum, whilst also maintaining it as a family home. So if you step into this house, it is like stepping into a real family home and seeing all the treasures and seeing all the wonderful hybridity, all the interesting things. You'll see traditional Chinese lanterns and Chinese calligraphy, but and mother of pearl furniture. But at the same time, you also see Venetian glass mirrors and chandeliers and English tapestry, sort of encapsulating all this hybridity and all these myriad cultures just into one particular culture. In Penang, you have the Penang Peranakan Mansion. I would say is not a museum, it's a mansion. It's owned by a collector who happened to be collecting it at the right time, because in the 60s, in the 1960s, the Straits Chinese, caught on the horns of the dilemma, many of them started throwing away and getting rid of their treasures. And this collector has collected them and put them into this incredible place with incredible collections. And in Singapore, you have the Peranakan Museum of Singapore at Amin Street. I was there at the launch of the Peranakan Museum in 2008, and Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong was the one who officiated the launch. And I remember him stepping on the stage and he said this very proudly, "I am Baba." So yes, Lee Kuan Yew was a Baba, a Hakka Baba, for a long time, because he was trying to encourage Mandarin. He did not emphasize his own ethnic identity. But 2008, Lee Hsien Loong stepped on stage and said, "I am Baba." Next slide. So if you step into there's so many Peranakan Chinese houses. There are all kinds. It's not like everyone lives in splendid chateaus or manors or bungalows. You have the whole range from simple cottages to thatched roofs in the countryside, to terrace houses, to grand mansions. For me, the ones that are most interesting are the terrace houses, and you'll see them in the UNESCO sites in Georgetown. You see them in the UNESCO site of Malacca, along Jonker Street and Heron Street, now called Jalan Tun Tan Cheng Lock. And in Singapore, you'll also see beautiful Peranakan houses in Emerald Hill, as well as Katong and Joo Chiat, and many other parts. For me, when you enter this house, the front is very short, but when you enter the house, you find it's very, very long. And for me, the part that I like most is the courtyard, very pretty. Sky wells, because the houses are so long, it's very dark, so you have courtyards. Next slide. The Nyonya Kitchen. This is the Nyonya Kitchen from the Baba Nyonya Museum. Fascinating place. This is the heart, the stomach of the house. This is where all the action takes place, and you find all the traditional instruments for cooking, the balanga, the batu giling, the batu lesung, the grinder, the pestle and mortar, and so on. So this is where the cooking takes place. And in the past, recipes, you just learn to cook, and you just go hands-on. There's no recipe books. Nothing is written down. It's passed on from generation to generation. Next slide. So I grew up in a household in Kuala Lumpur, a straight Chinese household, living with my parents and my paternal grandparents and my brother and my sister. And it was a house full of wonderful aromas, because mother was always cooking, not just one meal a day. No such thing as ordering Grab to call in some food. She made breakfast, she made lunch, she made tea, she made dinner, and sometimes she even made supper as well. And there was always wonderful smells coming from the kitchen, sounds of pounding, smells of sambal belacan being toasted, always a pot of coffee on the kitchen table. And there was always lots of people dropping in, going in, going out, and lots of languages because father only spoke English and Baba Malay. Mother spoke English, Penang Hokkien, Cantonese, and my ama, our black and white ama, spoke Cantonese, and my parents spoke English to us. So it was a whole array, a whole plethora of languages being spoken all the time, as well as all kinds of interesting cultures swirling all around me. So with all these wonderful inside experiences, I thought it would be time to capture these in stories because I've got so many wonderful stories from my mother, who's a great storyteller. Coffee table books are fine, but they capture things in a static way. How do you get across those wonderful stories? For example, I've got this uncle called Bluebeard in Penang, who, when he passed away, 7 mistresses turned up with children in tow. And I've got another relative, a beautiful girl who fell in love with someone when she was working as a croupier, and they started a courtship. But eventually, when they started comparing notes, they found that the childhood details were quite similar. And eventually, she found that she is the daughter. The both of them have the same father, just that the father had 5 wives, and she was the daughter of the 5th wife, and her boyfriend was the son of the 1st wife. So all these wonderful, interesting stories, I started writing them into short stories. Next slide. Next slide. So in 2011, I published a book called Kabaya Tales. Can you go back to the previous slide, please? Right. And I was very apprehensive after spending 4 years writing because I wondered, oh gosh, who's going to read stories of grandmothers and mothers? But if truth be told, the book sold out very quickly within the first print run. And I realized that actually we hunger for our local stories. In a world of globalization and mass homogenization, it is very important to write stories. So Kabaya Tales of Matriarchs, Maidens, Mistresses, and Matchmakers did very well. It went on to win first prize in a National Star Reader's Choice Award, after which I wrote 2 more short story collections. Next slide, please. Of course, naturally, if you call your first book Kabaya, you have to call the next book Sarong, right? So I called my second book Sarong Secrets. And after that, I thought I'm done, but I was asked to write another one. So I wrote another one called Manic Mischiefs. And these are all family photographs. There's my father there, there's my mother, and there's me, the little baby there. So keep your photographs. You never know how useful you'll become one day. Okay, next slide. If you're interested in reading my stories, they are available on Amazon.com as well as Kinokuniya, and they're also available as ebooks on Google Play. And if you're in Malaysia, you can find them in the bookstores, Eslit, Sutaya, MPH, as well as Kinokuniya. Next slide. I was also asked to give a talk by TEDx on the Babas and Nyonyas, and I tried to resist because I was terrified of the fact that I have to give a talk standing on a red dot with no lecterns and no notes allowed. Because as you know, in the TED Talks, you do not have the lectern. You do not have your notes. And being an academic, I'm used to having my notes for me. But anyway, after much persuasion, I took on the challenge. And if you're interested, you can listen to my TED Talk my TEDx talk called My Nyonya Journey. To my surprise, it has now garnered 53,000 views. So
To my surprise, it has now garnered 52,000 views.
At the end of my talk, next slide. So thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed my talk, and I am open to, before I take questions, can I have my discussant, Stephen Hall, to come on?
Yeah,
Thank you.
first, this is Bob here. I want to thank you very much, Dr. Lee, for this wonderful talk. And I have a million questions, and I'm going to ask most of them after Stephen. I have one though. Are there varied religions of the Peranakans, and if a Peranakan in Kuala Lumpur were to convert to Islam, would they be looked at askance by the other Peranakan community, or is it all mixed up in 2024? Is there a quick answer to that?
So this community and this culture evolved before the nation states were formed, right? So in that time, you could just embrace whatever religion you want to. But after 1957, with independence, it was mandated that it was constitutionally defined, a Muslim was defined as someone who practices the Islamic religion and who speaks Malay. So if you marry a Muslim and you're a Peranakan, you then have to convert to become a Muslim. So that sort of already pushed it away in the sense that you cannot have the mix of what we used to be, because that before independence, you could just, practice whatever religion you want. So in a way that has stopped it. But coming to your question, no, there's no prescribed religion for the Peranakans, but they mainly started out, I think, because they're very proud of the Chinese identity. They're probably Buddhist or Taoist or a whole mix. In fact, I remember my mother, she was so open-minded, she would pray to everything under the sun. She goes to the Buddhist temple and she prays to the Buddha. But whenever she passed the church, she would put her hands together and pray to the church. And I even see her putting her hands together and praying to the mosque. And also they were superstitious. They also, might believe in spirits and also lucky numbers. They were kind of like take on everything. Very, very open-minded. And but eventually, as the culture evolved and the community evolved, eventually after 500 years or so, they began to have barriers and began to close off embracing other cultures. So I remember later on, very much later on, I had a cousin who fell in love with a Javanese girl, Muslim girl, and his father was very, very upset and did not approve of the marriage. And I couldn't help thinking how ironical. Our origins are such that it was an embracing of all kinds of cultures, but in the end, you sort of like close your doors. So it varies from family to family. Some families are open, some families are not happy because they're worried that if you convert to Christianity or in a religion, you're not going to do the ancestor worship, you're not going to honor my memory, you're not going to hold a joss stick or light a joss stick to my name, and so on. So it varies from family to family. Many Peranakan families are Christians. There are also Peranakans who are Muslims, the whole range. There's no
Right.
prescriptive religion for the Peranakan Chinese.
Well, that's a great answer, and thank you very much. Dr. Hall, let's have you chat. I'm sure you were as engrossed as I was about this wonderful talk.
Yes, Kamsia, terima kasih, Sukim. Thank you very much, though, for making me hungry. I haven't had breakfast yet. I think one of the interesting things about all of this is to, in my 5 minutes, I'd just like to briefly go back to the sources of this and the links with mainland China, because I think that's probably of interest to our audience here. You've certainly covered the richness of the synthesis that marks the Pranakan as a unique group. And it's really quite interesting now that we see the revival happening within the Pranakan community. As people become more globalized, they also seem to want to get to their roots, just like myself being here in New Zealand with my 28 generations back Maori roots, mixing up with my 7 generations of the European roots. I think Ching Ho has an important role that should be highlighted when we look at the origins of this. But interestingly, in Malacca, when Ching Ho came here in one of his seven, well, in 6 of his 7 voyages between 1405 and 1434, he was sailing out of China with ships that make Christopher Columbus's ships look like tiny little models. And it's quite interesting to contextualize the culture in this merging between the Chinese and the people of this area. I think it's important to remember, though, that even when Cheng Ho came here, there were already Chinese who were engaged in the monsoon-based trade with Arabia. And many people don't consider that history is often a result of political choices and the way that history is represented. So Cheng Ho's contributions, which included weird things like taking a pair of giraffes from Kenya back to China, and that's documented. These things are often not seen as a result of politics because after Cheng Ho's voyages, things closed down. But the Chinese were already here, intermarried in a culture of synthesis. So thank you very much for sharing this culture of synthesis, which is much more than all the very varied parts and all the different layers that happen. Sukim hasn't mentioned, for example, that she speaks 6 languages. And this is not unusual in Malaysia, where everybody speaks at least 3 or 4 languages. I think it's also interesting to put everything together with the positioning of China itself now with the One Belt, One Road initiative. This is kind of rewinding on what Cheng Ho did with maritime routes. And we see an interest in Malacca from China itself now is quite marked because Malacca and Penang, as UNESCO cities, are repositories of cultural aspects, temples, and behaviors, many of which were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. So it's quite interesting to take Sukim's experience, which is symptomatic of many of the Peranakan Chinese, and see that it's of real interest to Chinese from China today because they're able to see, for example, the oldest temple in Malacca, 1720s, that see the Chinese craftsmanship from that period. So there's a whole historical basis that I wanted to add into this wonderful talk today. And just to say that I think there's also cultural behaviors too. So the Peranakan Chinese are Chinese, and yet they're something more. And it's a unique culture, it's a unique synthesis. And it's my privilege to have married into the situation. And I hope this sharing has been of interest to everybody here this morning, this afternoon, this evening, because I think that Peranakan culture is unique, it is special, it's right throughout Southeast Asia, right throughout Nusantara, and it has roots. So one last story to finish off. About 5 years ago, Sukum and I went to see a 9th century Chinese ship, which had come out of a desire to build a subdivision on a salt flat. And here was a 9th century Chinese ship with a Kuan Yin in the middle of it. It was about 60 meters long, and it was built with 4 kinds of timber from Siam, from Thailand, from Sumatra, from Java, and from the Malay Peninsula. And that's a 9th century Chinese ship. So China has reached out, and I see now with the present government's initiatives that in some ways it's rewinding all of the wonderful roots from which this fusion in Malacca has come about. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hall. So right this minute, I have all sorts of other questions. And I was wondering about housing. I presume that people, the Peranicans live everywhere. In the United States, it's actually very interesting. We had remarkable restrictions in housing where even here in San Diego, where I'm speaking from, you couldn't live in La Jolla if you were Chinese, which La Jolla is a neighborhood here. If you were Chinese or Japanese, even if you were white but Jewish, you couldn't live in La Jolla. Blacks couldn't live in La Jolla. And this only changed with the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968. So remarkably recently. And I was wondering whether there are any discriminatory issues in jobs or housing or whatever with respect to Peranicans, or have they sort of melded into the societies in which they live? Either of you could sort of answer, or both maybe.
I don't think there's any kind of restrictions at all regarding housing. You can live anywhere. You can live in a countryside. You can live in a city. But in some places, there are public quotas that you might have to observe. For example, there could be a quota for owners who are Bumiputras, so Malays, to buy certain houses. But if you've got the money, I think you can just choose to live anywhere. There's no such thing as a demarcation of zones for ethnic groups. Not at all. And thank goodness we don't have that. No.
That's it. That's wonderful, actually.
It's just money talks. That's the rule.
Well, that's how it is in the United States in 2024, but it wasn't before 1968. What about jobs? Are jobs freely available without issue regarding Peranakan versus
no issue. If you are able and you're capable and you apply and you qualify, then you get the job. But of course, again, as I mentioned, sometimes for certain jobs there are quotas because there's affirmative action here, the national economic policy, where some jobs there's a certain percentage of quotas. But again, there's no prescription of what jobs you can apply for or what jobs. But usually, the Peranakan Chinese, well, I don't think they're so keen to join the uniformed personnel. So you don't see many Peranakans
I think the biggest difference is there is no such thing as Chinatown really in Malaysia. And the complexity of Malaysia, where we actually have 138 languages happening within the Malaysian country itself. And the Chinese languages, some call them dialects, well, there's about 12. So the whole context of Malaysia is very complex. Sorry. So it's a very multi-layered thing. For example, in my university from which I've retired, in the Center for English Language Studies, where everybody was masters or PhD holders, specialists in English, we had 26 languages amongst us, amongst 40 people. And so this is the part where the Peranakan community fits in very well because people are very open to difference in Malaysia because there's been centuries of it.
Yeah. Hello. I want to thank all of you, including Dr. Bob, for this absolutely wonderful presentations. I could have listened to you for another 3 hours, but I only have a few comments. The first is, I understand that the Peranakans actually meet and have conventions, as Sue Kim said. When is the next convention and where will it be?
Oh, the next convention will be in Phuket, Thailand this year in November. So
November 24, 2024.
Yes, November 2024. And
Wonderful.
to match to coincide with the Loy Katong Festival.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Okay, right.
Wonderful.
The thriving Peranakan community in Thailand, especially in the island of Phuket, because they had a lot of interactions with the Penang and the Peranakan associations. There are around 15 Peranakan associations now within the Federation of Peranakan Associations, and they take turns to host the convention. So for this year, it will be in Thailand.
Wonderful.
What's interesting is the diaspora has gone in. You even have diasporic Peranakan communities now in Australia, and that's 3 Peranakan associations, one in Sydney, one in Melbourne, as well as one in Perth.
Wonderful. I also want to show you my own manek, which you showed everybody. I was fascinated by this kind of artwork, the UNESCO, what we call a heritage. But it is absolutely beautiful, and I just want to share with you. I also want to thank Jenny Cole for bringing Nyonya and Baba into my life, and it will always be part of my life. Thank you so much.
We do have a few questions from the audience. If you guys have a few more seconds, we'll field a couple of questions. We did have a number. We did have a number of comments. Sorry. We did have a number of comments from, audience members thanking you for your lovely talk and loving the clothing. As Stephen mentioned, you made us very hungry with your images of your dinner. That was absolutely delicious looking. Elena Wachong says, thank you for sharing. She's the ambassador from Costa Rica. So it's a melding of many different cultures. So we do have a question from Picky that says, how's Malaysian citizenship obtained? I heard if you're not Islamic Malay, you can't be a citizen.
You have to be born in Malaysia. If you're born in Malaysia, you are a Malaysian citizen.
So you can't, as someone moving in, become a citizen.
You would become a permanent resident, which is quite hard to obtain. I am a permanent resident, and I'm not Muslim. I'm Buddhist.
Got it. All right. Well, one more question. Fiel Sahir, do you still have a question? You did ask if there was a Q&A.
Hi, yes. Is it okay if I unmute?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, I'm an Indonesian Baba. And so I've just recently learned about my heritage. And I'm wondering, because I'm based in the United States, where I was born and raised, how would you suggest creating a Peranakan consciousness in the United States? Because I have met Peranakans here, but many people don't know that they are, which included me. And I don't know if that results in having an association at some point. I've spoken with Udaya Halim, and he recommended that I joined his. But at the same time, I don't know what's viable, but I do want to bring Peranakan consciousness to the forefront for us in the United States and North America.
Hello, can I have a question?
I think in the interest of time, that question by the gentleman from the United States will be the last one. Would either of you like to answer it? He's wanting to know about broadening Peranakan awareness in our country and clubs or organizations, that sort of thing.
Sukum, you're qualified to do this as you founded the KL Peranakan Association.
I think first of all, you have to find like a group of people, right, who are of like mind and who have the similar passion, who might have the similar interests, and maybe get together. Because otherwise, how do you sort of enjoy this culture? You could, I suppose, go online. There are lots of Peranakan Facebook groups now, all kinds of global Peranakan networks, Babas and Nyonyas, Peranakan clan, and so on. But different groups have got different interests. Some will just post